This is the Authority Company Podcast, conversations with leaders who are designing the future. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and my guest today is Dr. Chrisanne Gordon. Chrisanne is a physician and founder of the Resurrecting Lives Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting veterans living with traumatic brain injury. After surviving a brain injury herself, she turned personal experience into a mission, advocating for better care, faster intervention, and a system that does not leave veterans behind. She's also the author of the new book, Guarding Our Guardians, Guaranteeing America's Veterans a Future from Deployment to Employment, a call to fix the broken path from military service to civilian life, ensuring veterans get the care, support, and opportunity they earned. Dr. Chrisanne Gordon, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well, and thank you so much for having me. I so appreciate what you are doing for the nation at large, actually, by introducing people with experiences and something to say. And I like having something to say, so thank you.
I'm glad you have something to say. Otherwise, this would be a very awkward
It would
podcast. So
be.
I appreciate it. And you do have an amazing story to tell that you've been very open and transparent about. You're dealing with a traumatic brain injury. And it's funny too, because when I started reading up on you and the book, I was like, oh, okay. I guess this is a book about, helping, soldiers and people in the military recover from TBI. So I'm automatically assuming, oh, she must have been like a surgeon in the battlefield or or involved in military hospitals, but that's not the case. So before we get into your mission and what you're doing with the book, if you don't mind, I know you shared the story a bunch, but like this idea of you suffering a TBI, and usually for people who hear these stories, Chrisanne, it's always like they had this traumatic fall from like a cliff or something or a car accident. Yours is a lot more complicated, but also very simple. And it was you carrying a large box of china.
Correct. Correct. I mean, forgetting the coefficient of friction I learned in physics, pushing this china from high tile carpet onto cement and literally gave way. And literally, I say, when God deals with me, it's always in some kind of comic, kind of a comedial way. You know,
Sure.
head brick wall out. I mean, it was so stupid. It was a klutzy move on my part. It only transpired over like maybe 3 feet. Do you know what I mean?
Wow. That's
And
so
I was
wild.
out. And before that, I had been, a physical medicine physician. I've been that since 1988. Very interested in brain injury, and to get my own was the best education I ever had because I realized that, man, I'm telling people to do this and that doesn't work at all. So I consider, Joe, that moment in time, that head brick wall being the call to duty. Yeah, that's where the journey began. I began by being fine one moment, and the next moment I was not. And for the next 2 years, I was, coming on back. And I always tell all my vets, I never got my battle wound in battle. It was stupid. It was klutzy. But I do understand the recovery process somewhat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no doubt. And it's wild with I think with doctors, there is a bit of cognitive dissonance of like you're dealing with all these things for other people, but none of this stuff will ever happen to me. Like I think there's a layer to
You're
that. I'm not
absolutely
sure
right.
all doctors are.
Absolutely right. We take care of it, so we can't be harmed by it. Exactly.
Yeah. And so when that happened to you in that moment, and I want to deal more into the book, but your recovery process, let's get into that a little because I mean, a big part of the book is helping, these soldiers and these brave heroes, recover. What was your like? How long did it take to like you becoming the Chris Ann Gordon that you were used to?
Yeah, I've never been that person again. I've never
Wow.
been close to that person again. I mean, my photographic memory left in an instant, and it wasn't completely. I don't know if you always think of Sheldon Cooper and eidetic memory. It wasn't completely that, but it was really good. And my ability to read and remember has never come back. I read
Wow.
that kind of thing. But on the flip side, I gained a certain fearlessness that I didn't have before. So I always say that, my brain was remodeled in order to comply to the boot camp and then my mission that followed. So, as a single person living alone, it was, if I'd been more alert, it would have been more terrifying because I couldn't speak at all. And I mean, I had taken care of patients with aphasia, we call it, inability to speak, but I mean, not utter a sound, like no sound whatsoever. So to be inside a brain that had something to say, like the best I could do when a friend finally came over and got me just by divine providence, I could only write ER. I couldn't
Wow.
say anything. I couldn't do it. So it was a very interesting thing. And I think of my situation of spending about maybe 6 to 8 weeks. I always say on the floor of my office at my home in the dark, because if you have a brain injury, the photophobia, the amount of light that's let in is just, I mean, it's blinding. So, unable to speak, just thinking, am I ever going to be useful again? Yeah.
Wow. Well, certainly you have, and you know what I want to ask you is because I watch a lot of Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune, and if you watch those shows, it's basically all geared towards people like much older than me. It's like all these pharmaceuticals for seniors, and then Prevagen pops up all the time.
Yes.
Have you thought about as you get older? I mean, all our brain functions eventually slow down. We lose a few miles per hour from our fastball, as they say. How does that relate to people who have suffered a TBI? Is that exacerbated or is it just the same as everyone else?
Oh, well, no, and that's a great question, Joe. I mean, first of all, we know that about every 7 years or so, the brain kind of remodels a bit, kind of changes around just a little bit. But people who have traumatic brain injury, it's why now we call it a chronic illness. It's no longer an injury now. There are certain chemical compositions, certain structural things that happen there that make your brain more susceptible as time goes on to old people's diseases. The dementia,
Right.
Parkinson's, movement disorders, because we have the pituitary gland and all of our great hormones are there in the center, and it will get you into those issues sooner too. So yes, there is a definite difference. And yes, I have thought about it, and I've not yet taken Prevagen, but I look at that every time. Every time.
Okay, great. All right. So thank you very much for sharing that. So let's connect your struggles with veteran struggles today. Tell me how that leap happened. Where was your sort of gateway into realizing? And obviously, you probably knew that for the United States being involved in military actions for decades, a lot of people have suffered in post. Tell me about how you connected your life to theirs.
Okay, and it was a moment, it was the inciting incident. If you're used to
Sure.
script writing, that was the inciting incident, and it was this. I went to the ER that night I was telling you about, and they did an MRI, and the MRI was normal. But I couldn't speak, and I couldn't see the doc. I mean, it was like, eyes kinda like you're underwater, and you know how you look at things on the surface? That's how my world around me was, and I'm not
Wow.
trying to make it dramatic, because again, I wasn't courageous, I was a klutz. I'm just trying to say I was shocked even internally that there was that much change from what had happened. But that being said, I had a normal MRI. But my colleagues were taking care of me. Never once did they think I was faking. Never once did they, the old gal's just gotten a little crazier than normal. Oh, she must be under stress. Nobody used any of those terms. Okay. So let's fast forward to approximately 7 years later when I pick up the paper and the headline says, Veterans coming back from Afghanistan malingers. First of all, what an amazing headline. And that was a national paper. And then I read further and it was all because they had normal MRIs. So what were they doing? And I looked at this and honest people who know me know I'm Irish Catholic. I look at signs all over the place. I looked and I go, "Oh, this is not going to play well for me." Sooner or later, I'm going to have to get involved because I understand from the inside out what is going on here and maybe just maybe someone would listen to that.
Now, when you use that word in the book, I actually stopped and I was like, "Malinger. What is that? What is malingering?"
In medicine for people who don't really have an issue. They have all of these symptoms and they're going to keep these symptoms forever, most often for either sympathy or to be victimized or to get benefits if indeed you're feeling this way because of an incident that may have been somebody else's fault. So that's what we mean by malingers. Fakers.
Okay.
That's basically
Ah,
a nice long term for faker. And I go,
interesting.
it can't be. And I'm thinking, again, Joe, I'm thinking, my head brick wall. These guys are blown up in battle. And not just once. When I began doing some screenings, the average was 8 or 9 times that these young men's brains
Wow.
had been completely shattered. by IEDs, by the explosive devices, the improvised, and it's terrible. It's terrible.
W Wow. Alright, so tell me about you reading this article about the malingerers, and
I didn't like
how do I'm assuming at that point, you're doing deep dives and you're learning about the system in which these folks are being, either treated or whatnot, or not being treated, and
can
you
get
and you
there. You can't get there. You know, I couldn't figure out what was going on because there are, kind of newspaper articles and flash articles coming from the government, from the VA, and you don't know if that's real or imagined. So, as part of the scheme, a friend of mine, one of my colleagues, my radiologic colleague, lost his nephew in Iraq. And when he did that, that changed everything because now it's close to home. Okay. Now I have an uncle, at least, that I'm working with, that I could kind of find out what was going on. What I did was I happened to call the VA in Columbus. I was living in Columbus at the time, and say, okay, you know, in this young man's honor, his name was Sergeant Zachary McBride, and Zachary, you know, was a 20-year-old at the time he died. He was 17 years old when he convinced his family to sign off so that he could join the military because he wanted to make us safe. Seriously, wanted to make us safe. So I called the VA and I said, "What can I do to honor him?" And I always say this was the most amazing phone call because, first of all, somebody answered in 3 rings, and that never happened again. And the second thing that happened is the person answered said, "Oh, I'm going to put you in charge right away with our director. Let me get him for you." And I'm thinking, okay. And that never happened again either, even when I needed a director. But that being said, the director gets on, wonderful man, wonderful physician, rehab physician from the Philippines, gets on and says, "Dr. Gordon, I just finished the novena this morning. That's saying the rosary for 9 days. So you are the answer to my prayers." And I feel
Wow.
like, now I'm really in it. I mean, now I'm really in it. So I said, "Can I make baskets? What can I do?" He goes, "No, no, we need physicians to do the screening for the veterans who are coming back to Central Ohio to find out if indeed they show signs of traumatic brain injury. Would you do that? And would you come work for us?" I go, "Well, I don't think I can work for you. I have my own practice, and I'm not sure that I'm enough of a company person to work for you, but I'll be happy to volunteer for a few days a month." And that's what I did. A couple days a month, I went there, and from like 7 a.m. till 4 p.m., I reviewed the charts, what was there, which was very minimal. That's when I found out that medical records don't really transfer from the Department of War to the VA. Most of these young men, and I only saw men there, most of these young men had no idea what had really happened to him after. I mean, they had this a day, their phone rounds. Some of them were 3 days before they woke up, but they're still
Wow.
fighting, Joe. They're still in battle. Or as the war kind of went on, then they were taken to these places, the forward operating base, and kind of kept segregated for a period of time, 24, 48 hours, as opposed to my 6 weeks on the floor. Do you know what I mean? Like, the whole
Yeah.
thing was just, uh, it was just not sitting well with me. Now, granted, they were a lot younger and they were a lot healthier. I did get that. But by the same token, I had about 20 years of secondary school stored in my hard drive. They didn't have that. They had a high school hard drive that suddenly bashed. And I'm thinking, it's going to be harder to learn, but what had they got left? So it was a very amazing experience, and I did that for about a year and learned a lot. And that's where I base. I was like in the trenches, so to speak, with
Right.
it. And what the veterans found out is that I really wasn't kind of somebody who was employed by them. They felt good in giving me their secrets, which I then turned into a blast to that paper, but putting my name on it instead, so that they would be out of harm's way, that kind of thing.
Wow, that's great. That's so cool. And it's funny, as someone who's been an American and who's always supported the troops, the one thing that I've always found funny is in America, our elected officials have always found a way to cut things. Like
Yes.
they've cut healthcare, they've cut spending on programs to help the poor and all that jazz. The one thing that will never cut is military spending. If you look at the pie graph, it
Isn't
goes
that
up,
the truth? I
it
know,
it goes up, up and up and up.
by the billions it goes up. You know,
By the
and
billions.
here's the thing, so good that you would say that, Jo on the flip side, the amount of money that takes to rehabilitate those wounds of war keeps going down or becomes more fragmented. So it's like a double-edged sword, you know, you get more. I mean, look at the world today. I look at the world every night on the nightly news and think how many people's sons and daughters now have a permanent brain injury because of what happened today in multiple countries across the globe. And those are wounds of war that last for the generations. You know, it really does. So we ought to think more about what we're doing, which is one of the reasons why I want to bring up about how difficult it is to rehab this, because maybe if we stop and thought about the true cost of war, it isn't even in these dollars, it's in lost lives, lost futures. You know, perhaps there's different things that could have been invented that will now never be invented because the person who thought it, you know, has lost their ability to do that.
Yeah. So let's go into that nuance a little bit about the spending, because like we said, we automatically assume that they're always going to spend money on the U.S. military. But you said the care and the ability to help these people recover when they get back. That is not much as a focus of that military budget that we hear is like trillions of
Right.
dollars.
Well, here's
Um,
the thing about that. Let me just interrupt. The military has nothing to do with you after you leave. You're done.
right.
The VA is a total separate silo, which means so much because records from the Department of War don't make it over to the VA in the vast majority of cases. And that's one of the things that Dr. David Shulkin, the ninth secretary of the VA, who was so wonderful to write our prologue, that's what he was saying. That's step number one. We need to get record transfer. And then the records don't necessarily go to the veteran, even though they're begging for them. They don't always get their medical record. I have one that I'm working with now. We've been working 20 years trying to get his medical record. Now, here's what's so amazing, because we have all these HIPAA laws
Yeah.
that actually protect all of us. We will get your medical record. If not, you know, your physician needs to be recorded. You know, they will lose their license, but not for those people who volunteered their lives for our ability to get the medical record. They often can't get them. And that's step one that I talk about in the book. We need to make sure that not only is there transferability, that there's also transparency, that we can see what actually happened. And it can go from, for instance, the VA to a specialist in the area of traumatic brain injury, which is the signature word of these wars, and of which I think you'll be surprised to see that in healthcare, all of healthcare everywhere, less than 20% of healthcare providers ever touch a patient with traumatic brain injury
Wow.
because it's a very narrow and deep field. The brain rehabs itself different than any other body part. It takes longer than any other body part, and it usually is by people who don't have great means, because you lose your ability to think as I did, and you really have nothing. You
Wow.
can't live as an organism in this world if you can't figure out how to eat or dress yourself or get up. You know.
Now on the civilian side of things, I know as physicians, you know this is the electronic medical record, the EMR, EHR. It's interchangeable. How we're able to move our records willy nilly from a hospital organization to another. I know that some of you doctors are not big fans of the actual EHR and how it works all the time. It's not a perfect system, but why can't that idea of the EHR, EMR from your military records transfer over to the VA? I mean, I'm probably asking a really silly question, but it seems like a simple solution, but it seems like it's a complicated fix.
It is a complicated fix because they've always been a separate medical care entity. Now, I was told when I went there and I wanted to see some things, you know, because I want to get the whole idea of what happened to this person, that, you know, that's to protect the veteran, you know.
We
And
get
I'm like,
that.
"Look,
Yeah, sure.
the
Yeah,
veteran's asking for it.
right.
The veteran wants me to see it so that I can get him to a place where, you know, he needs to be, you know. But that's the old days. That really has changed a lot from when I was there, you know, back in 2008 to 2009. It's changed a lot. It's gotten a lot better thanks
Okay.
to, I believe, some excellent VA administrators and some excellent VA secretaries. Robert McDonald, Bob McDonald, who was, PP&G's CEO from here in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was wonderful because I was able to actually get some of these issues explained to him. And our foundation, Resurrecting Lives Foundation, got a letter from him saying any veteran that we saw that was having troubles had to have a VA appointment within 2 weeks. Do you know how many lives that saved, Joe? Every single one of them.
Wow.
Every single one of the people who had somebody listen to them and get started on a pathway toward a new normalcy. That's what we call it, the new normal. Everyone who got that had hope and got better. And that's what we need to have happen from the very beginning. One of the things we talk about, and these are, this book is really funny because it's really not my opinion, but it is experts across the country in various different areas here who I happen to form my opinion after listening to them. And one of them is Dr. Hermit Thakur, who is right in the beginning of the book says we need a boot camp. Just as they have boot camp to get them ready, they need a boot camp to decompress, to get their medical record together, to get some testing and see what they want to do when they grow up. This is a whole new area. They've already done the toughest thing a person could ever do, volunteer their lives for strangers, and did it in, war situations that I'm being told by my vets and by the generals who have been there a long time. It is like a video game. It's hard. Suddenly the sky fills up with all of these little mechanical drones and your life is a danger. But when you see them just kind of going through the sky, it looks like birds. It's really a whole different process. But instead of being here, you got 1 week to attend 8 hours worth of class a day for 5 days. We're going to teach you everything you need to know about finances and raising a family and having a home and transportation. We're going to teach you all that in 5 days. And then you're on your way and see ya. And here's your, handful of pills. Here's your handful of cash. Have at it. That
Wow.
doesn't work.
I,
That
I
just
know this. I know this isn't your expertise, but just because when you mentioned it, I was kind of surprised because I always assumed, I think, for people outside of the Department of well, the Department of Defense or whatever you want to call it, and the VA, I always assumed they were all under one umbrella. What is the point of that
two totally
separation?
separate umbrellas.
What's the point of that?
There's when somebody leaves the care of the Department of War, their accountability is over. The Department of War's accountability is over. Their liability is zero. You can't sue the Department of War for what happened under their employment. Okay. So it goes into a medical legal system, or I should say, the VA was originally set up, in my thoughts from everything I read, as a legal medical system. Okay. Kind of like, okay, we're going to get all this data. We'll take care of it from here. Don't worry about it. We've got it. But in 1919 and after the First World War, after the Second World War, we didn't have anything compared to what we have going on now. In the era since World War II, in particular, things have changed so much in terms of medicine, in terms of weaponry, in terms of what you can do in society. Like when the World War II veterans came back, because I suddenly became I had to study history for the first time
Sure.
in my life. And studying that, it's funny because one of my favorite VA social workers says, Doc, after World War II, everybody had an Uncle Joe in the attic. He says, everybody, he was in the attic apartment, he was in the garage apartment, just like I think that anybody who really wants to know, like even up to the Vietnam era, Al Pacino in Scent of a Woman, he lived
Sure.
in the garage apartment of his niece and they couldn't understand him from Adam, but they were looking after him. That doesn't happen anymore. Do you know? I will tell you this. This is one of the most disheartening things that I think could ever happen to a human being. My cell phone is unlisted, and yet I've received suicide threat calls from veterans from 29 states. Now that tells you we've got a broken system. And that tells you how desperate they are and that they trade my number. It has to be handed over. Okay. You can't look me up and find it. So that being said, 6 of them were young men who came home and there was a new family in their house. Because with cell phone technology, their spouse and the children had moved elsewhere and they weren't sure where they were. So you come home from war, you have a traumatic brain injury, you have the unsteadiness of being now in the 21st century again. Okay. You're not surrounded by your battle buddies who've been with you for the whole last year, and you've got strangers in your home and you don't know what to do. Now, that has to be as abandoned as somebody can be. Seriously. I mean, there's plenty other ways of being abandoned, but that's right down there with some of the worst of them.
My God, that's terrible. Geez, what a horrible like thing to imagine to be after all these things these folks have been through, and then to walk home expecting to get a hero's welcome, and all of a sudden there's some dude sitting on your couch, and you're like, who the hell are you? I mean, that's nuts. You mentioned the word system. So, what does the system get wrong about these invisible injuries like TBI and PTSD? What at the core?
Yeah, at the core.
What's the system getting wrong?
Okay, at the core, it's a medical problem, across the board. Traumatic brain injury is the least understood because we've never been able to look into the brain until just recently. And we began looking into the brain with some amazing neuroradiologists, of which I've got to say, Dr. Michael Lipton, who MD, PhD, now at Columbia, before that was at Albert Einstein. He did our pilot study to prove that the IED blast caused brain injury. And he did it because he was one of the 7 people in the world at that time that could read diffusion tensor imaging that was just coming out and could see where actual pathways, neural pathways were torn and ripped. And he was able to define the areas that were most sensitive to this happening in the theater. I mean, what he did, and then many others followed, Dr. David Brody, Dr. Jeffrey Bazarian. I mean, this young group of researchers both in the ER medicine, think of this, ER medicine, neuroradiology kind of took it from here's the injury, here's what it really looks like. Here's what it looks like to us on MRI. We thought we were looking at we weren't looking, we were just gazing. Yeah, we were just barely looking at the surface. And that's what's changed. So now that we can see the brain, we need to open up the VA system with the civilian system. The civilian system still has 99% of those resources. We've still got those great MRI equipment that you can't put in every VA. It would be too expensive for a separate system. So let's use the system that we have. And that's something that we've started doing with the Mission Act and some of the acts that have been passed so that our veterans can be seen in the community. It's not done in every community with the same pizzazz, but where there are teaching hospitals, tertiary hospitals, where there's the VA started a polytrauma system. And I mean, kudos to Dr. David Sifu, who is a PM&R doc, who said, hey, we need to get hospitals set up near these VAs, so Palo Alto VA and Tampa VA and San Antonio, where large groups of veterans are coming back from war, and we need to take care of them right from the beginning. And that was the beginning of what we see as a joint system somewhere down the road. So, I mean, these are great minds that were able to work through a system that was stable. I can't work through that system. I'm not easy enough to do that. So he said that. I'm not smart enough to do it, and I don't know how to get there. I just say, here's the problem. Here's what we need to fix it. Work it out.
All right. Well, Chrisanne, I got to ask you because I'm often told that I oversimplify things, but the idea of these VA hospitals not having the technology and the resources to have these machines, right?
Right, right.
Am I oversimplifying by saying if the VA doesn't have that, why can't these soldiers and these heroes go to other medical facilities and have their treatments paid for by the VA? Or is that not a thing? Tell me how, explain that to
That is
me.
something that needs to be worked in. It absolutely should be. And it's just, I mean, it's starting. When I say just starting, it's been starting over the course of maybe the last decade, but
Okay.
things move slowly. I mean, here was my biggest problem with being a volunteer physician in the VA system. I'd never worked in a government system before, ever. And it's so much slower, and I tend to be, particularly after my brain injury, I've always been kind of, energetic, but after my brain injury, I become kind of hypomanic in it. And I mean, you see a guy who's struggling right here in front of you today, you want that answer, not a year from now, not 5 years from now. I want it to be worked out in the course of the next couple months. If we have to have him go someplace else, and we have to have her go to a hospital within this area or we need to do that as a nation. We need to make that commitment. I think it was really interesting in the prologue of the book. I think the most important sentence in the book comes from our ninth Secretary of the VA, Dr. David Shulkin, who said, you know, it's not a charity case to take care of veterans. It's a civil obligation. You know, we have 1% of our nation now volunteering to serve in the military. That ought to scare all of us as we're looking about and seeing what's going on. If we don't take care of them, first thing that'll happen is we'll lose that very good mind, that very good that body that was lean and like the athletes. The only other people that are as trim as our military are athletes. And we ruin their brains too. Let's get serious. There's a whole lot of brain bashing going on in the NFL and the NHL as well, not to mention soccer. So we need to start taking care of those issues like 100 years ago. But since we aren't, let's do it now. And there is that exact system. So we make Tuesday Veterans Day. Get
Yeah.
transportation for these veterans. Move them to because to move through a big hospital system, I don't know. I used to work there and it was hard enough working there. But if you're coming in as a patient and you're dazed and confused, no idea how to get there.
And one thing you write about in the book is you prefer the term brain health over mental health. And I know this
I
is semantics, but
I
why does the
it's
language
big
matter so
semantics.
much?
It's
It's what
big semantics. I will tell you, I was taught by my veteran that day. Okay, let me tell you. So I'm from Youngstown, Ohio. All right. And I always say, this is why I have a lot of friends here. That's why I came back here for this movement. Youngstown, Ohio, when I was growing up, was known as Murder Town, USA. Okay. We had more murders per capita here than any place else in the United States. We had a couple families of organized crime that would like to, take people out here, that sort of thing. So just get that into mind. The third patient I see in the VA, and I'd already seen two totally broken young men, totally broken. And in comes the third. And I'm seeing this for the first time. And he's got, reflector sunglasses on so that I can't see him and so that it protects his eyes from the photophobia. So already I know he has a brain injury. Okay. Um, and he's talking about how useless he is, how terrible he can't do anything. And how when his daughter dropped a book, he jumped. I go, well, let me tell you, I was leaving the Southern Park Mall, the biggest mall here in Youngstown, Ohio, because I was working there in the summer. And it's late at night, it's 10 o'clock. We've already closed up. We're walking from Sears and we're walking to our cars. And the first person in the car turns the ignition and it backfires. When Youngstown, Ohio, the car bomb was the number one way that somebody would die in a hit.
wow.
And all 18 of the rest of us hit the asphalt. I mean, because in Youngstown, that was a car bomb until proven otherwise. Okay. Nothing happened. We didn't even say anything to each other. We just get up, dust off the asphalt, get in our cars, and drive away. The moment I finished that story, Joe, he grabbed my wrist so hard. He ripped off his reflector sunglasses. He goes, Doc, what you're telling me right now is I'm not crazy. Now think of that. He had been out for 6 or 7 months thinking he was crazy. And that's when I said, you know what? You're out of your brain. You're not out of your mind. And there's a difference. And from that day forwards, one of the docs in the ER used that for me. And it's one of the few things I remember that night of my injury. And I thought, that's really true because you think you're out of your mind. We equate the two, but they're very different. You're out of your ability to do the chemical to receptor to neural pathway to act. You don't have that. I do believe that going down the road, what we will soon know is it won't be this big bowl of mental health. It'll be you have this receptor problem or you have this chemical problem. We're just not smart enough to know that right now. So that's why I use that. That's why I'm very interested in that because what I see is I tell my vets and myself, I've got a brain injury. I've got hope I can do something about it. If they say I've got mental health, all I can be is medicated, and that doesn't show me a path to my future.
Love that. That's great. So I know you've written a couple books now, but in writing and researching this one, what was the one thing that surprised you the most about this? Because you'd already been sort of inundated, been in this world, volunteering, helping people, starting the foundation. But what was the most? Was there something that came up? You're like,
Yes.
oh, geez,
Yes. Yes, and I have to thank you, Forbes Books and Forbes Foundation, because they not only was I able to get experts on my own, they provided experts too to help with the writing and all of that, which was great. And the thing that actually shocked me the most is that nobody who was writing from Forbes had ever heard of any of this.
Wow.
And we're talking about, my Ezra Buyer, who just took this project himself. Ezra's in his mid 30s. He's a young writer and he has many friends who served in the military, were in the Marines. So he was in it. He was so shocked by some of the things that I was saying. And yet he had talked to them and he said, well, they didn't tell me this. I said, they won't. I said, veterans don't speak. They don't speak about their injury. They don't speak about what's bothering them because they keep it all internalized, both because they're taught that way in the military and both because they were that way before they went there. They're not telling the coach on Friday night football that they're feeling a little woozy from being hit last game because this is the season closer. They're going to it. It's that personality.
Wow. All right. So that's awesome. In closing here, so how could we help? How could the wimps and cowards like me, who are not who are not seeing battle, who are not risking our lives for this country, what can we do? And I know it could start with donating to your foundation, Rescuing Lives Foundation. First of all, tell us about that, and tell us what else we can do.
Okay, Resurrecting Lives Foundation was born for veterans from the global war and terror, Iraq and Afghanistan with traumatic brain injury because it's what I knew, it's what I had, it's what I was felt I was called to do. When I would see, it was my tour of duty in the VA that convinced me this is what we have to do. And we do have a website, resurrectinglives.org. Right now, what we are doing is this book is our call to action for the nation. All right. Now, I've never seen in my lifetime more confusion on Capitol Hill, more division in our nation, more warring going on around the world in so many different places. What we can unite ourselves with is taking care of the warrior, taking care of the person who volunteered their lives to protect us in these instances. If we do that, we get Capitol Hill doing things. Because if your congressman or senator are one of the several that aren't resigning this year, who are actually going through, or the people who are campaigning who really want to go there and do something that's going to make a difference, this is going to make the biggest difference in our nation than we have ever seen. If you think of veterans, they treat each other as brothers and sisters. They are the most united group, even though they come from multiple different parts of the country, multiple ethnicities, multiple races, multiple religions. All of that is gone. They are united as a mission. That's what we need to do. We need to unite in this mission for them for a couple purposes. First of all, it is the thing we are meant to do. You take care of those who volunteer their lives for you. Secondly, it makes us stronger as a nation. Our tagline is resurrect a hero, strengthen a nation. Because what we've seen with vets that are able to turn around is they become, the leaders of the community. They go to Congress, they go to say they're not leaving. They're sticking, they're going to make sure that we get the services that all of them need. And it also then helps strengthen our medical communities at large. And the third thing it does is it unites us. We don't care. I'd cared less what party you belong to. People try to get me in this political. I said, you take care of veterans, I'm in your face. You're mine. You're mine. I want you. I want you to help us do this. And I think we need to shake some of these labels. These are not veterans, oh, I support veterans. If you ask somebody that, what do they mean by they support veterans? It's more than clapping for them at the airport or during a thing. But in all honesty, our civilian world doesn't know how we can support. We
Yeah.
need to get uh, together as a unit to write to our congressman, particularly the top 10 states of veterans in the Union: California, Texas, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, New York. Those states harbor most. Let's get your people both on a local level, on a state level, and on a national level to change these things, to make the separation process easy so that they have a chance for a future. Healthcare, education, employment after they leave the military. How's that?
That works for me. And you can start by reading Guarding Our Guardians, Guaranteeing America's Veterans a Future from Deployment to Employment. She is Dr. Chrisanne Gordon. Chrisanne, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate you and Forbes Books so very much. Take care now. Bye-bye.
And that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to find out more information about Chrisanne and her other amazing authors, go to theauthoritycompany.com.